what is the fundamental distinction between having an organisation which is diverse and having an organisation which is truly inclusive? So when we in our institutions and when I deal with executives all the time, they talk about, we need to have a D&I strategy. And when they say it, they kind of say it like that, as if D and I are the same thing. Now, we know that they're completely different, but of course they're aligned together. But the way that it's operationalised is quite clunky, and it's really a bit of a kind of it's really a Noah's Ark approach, which is, we'll have two of them, two of them, two of them, and two of them. And the approach so far has had some success. So we have definitely seen more women entering the world of business. We've definitely seen more BME groups entering the world of work as well. But we've ended up with quite an interesting dynamic. And the dynamic is this: high levels of organisational diversity, but lower levels of organisational inclusivity. Now think about that for a moment. Just cogitate on that. In your businesses, you've got two big strategic assets. One of your assets is your external stakeholders, generally your customers, and the other asset is your people, your talent. Now imagine if you want to be, and we haven't got time to talk about all of this today, but all of the research from Harvard, from Boston Consulting Group, McKinsey talks about when we have diversity and inclusion, we reduce groupthink, but we get innovation and creativity. What happens when you're in an environment, what happens to your talent when you have high diversity but low inclusion? What is your talent likely to do? Somebody give us some thoughts. Yeah, what's it likely to do? Leave. It's likely to leave. I'm here, but I'm not valued particularly. I'm not respected, and my skill set is definitely not leveraged. I think I might go somewhere else. Interestingly, the research tells us that lots of people do leave, but actually a whole bunch of people stay. They don't leave, but they mentally check out. Now think about that. How can you create an organisation which is smart in terms of its decision making, innovative and creative, if you've got a whole bunch of people that are here, but they've mentally checked out? The basic deal is you can't. So the first message is we're not talking about diversity today, we're talking about diversity plus inclusion and the alignment of the two. And that's where we really get the innovation and the creativity. You might have heard of people like Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman is really the founder of behavioural science. He's done a lot of work around kind of cognitive biases and social biases and the rest of it. Just quick show of hands, how many of you in your organisations have done things like unconscious bias training? Yeah, so a few of you would have done unconscious bias training and stuff like that. So some of you might know that we as human beings basically have a default position. We are neurologically wired to gravitate towards people who are like us. We're designed to gravitate towards people that look like us and sound like us and think like us, people that come from similar backgrounds, etc. And obviously then that unconscious bias starts to play out in terms of the types of people that we attract in terms of our recruitment processes. So we've got to think about, well, if we can challenge the norms of how we do recruitment, if we can work towards creating an environment which is truly diverse and inclusive, the first thing we have to do is to figure out, well, what is unconscious bias? We can have a conversation about that. That's kind of interesting, actually, but what's much more important than talking about the neurology, although I could talk to you about that all day long, is really about what is the impact of this. So how does bias impact our recruitment process, and how does it impact our talent assessment process once we get people in? In hiring, often the emotional connection in hiring is often, what university did you go to? So if I went to Durham and you went to Durham, I am loving you. It's called the love prejudice, yeah? That's how the whole thing works out in terms of affinity. So when we're hiring, we have like CVs and resumes, your conscious brain's looking for, what kind of skills, what kind of attributes do you have? And your unconscious is reading and it's saying, right, to what extent are you like me? Or to what extent is this candidate like us? And it's like, Durham, tick. Oh, they're interested in, skiing, tick. They're interested in X, ticks. Oh, they're interested in Y, cross, don't like that. So that's how the human brain works essentially, and that's this notion of affinity bias. Confirmation bias I'll come back to, and some of those I'll come back to as we kind of go through essentially. In terms of the recruitment process, there's lots of kind of different stages, but these are obviously the 5 kind of key stages. One is around sort of job design. We know that bias becomes essentially bias operates at a number of levels. One is clearly behavioural. What's my interaction with people who are similar and people who are different? But bias actually becomes embedded within organisational systems themselves. So when you think about designing job descriptions and person specifications, what is the kind of language that we put into those things which essentially enables us to attract certain types of people, or maybe it puts certain types of people off. So we do need to think about how we construct job descriptions and person specs. That's the key thing. Candidate attraction, basic things, you know, where do we put our job adverts? What is the imagery that we put on our campaigns? Those sorts of things. So we know that bias clearly plays out there. Affinity bias will definitely play out in terms of the shortlisting process. The first time that you see a candidate is generally on a piece of paper, or these days electronic. You know, you might see information about them on LinkedIn or something like that. And we will form an impression of somebody on a piece of paper by their name, by their postcode, you know, all of that sort of thing. The second time that we're potentially likely to meet a candidate is at the, the interview process. So when we go through shortlisting, we'll make those assessments. When we interview, something called confirmation bias kicks in. We've already formed an impression of somebody by their CV. When we get them at interview, we're actively looking for information which either confirms our positive impression generally. So we're starting to skew our questions to look for impressions of them already. And then debriefing is quite a key one. You can't really make an effective change in organisations unless you know what the issue is and what you're doing. And so that, for me, that kind of falls into this whole kind of, data analytics and data tracking. So many of us will collect information, particularly at the recruitment stage, around gender, ethnicity and other areas. But lots of us don't really track. So if we go back, for example, are we tracking who's applying for roles, who's been shortlisted, are we tracking who's been interviewed, are we tracking who's been appointed? So you can really identify those kind of specific biases at those particular decision points, basically. But it is important that you don't just collect data. If you're collecting it and you're not analysing or doing anything with it, it's a relatively pointless exercise, actually. So the point about this is saying, look for trends and patterns, actually. But what can we do? So in terms of things like job design, there's some fairly smart technology now. So again, we'll keep going with the show of hands thing. How many of you use AI technologies, so particularly things like Textio? Is anyone using Textio? Yeah, so that would make sense that a whole bunch of you using that. Textio is it's quite a useful product, actually. When you look at the results of Textio and the impact it has in terms of just throwing up those hotspots in terms of what we might call agentic language or communal language in terms of things like job design. It has shown to be quite effective in terms of really throwing up those hotspots, and it's relatively, it's effective, but also it's relatively cheap. So there are a whole bunch of technologies out there, so I would encourage you to do things like that. Things like candidate attraction. I am a great believer. Actually, I was on a panel debate yesterday, and we were talking about diversity quotas, and the whole kind of thing was, things are taking so long, should we move towards diversity quotas? I'm not really sure where I am. I mean, I used to be completely against quotas, actually, because I would suggest that diversity quotas are a bit of a sticking plaster in terms of what the structural issues are. I'm starting to change my mind. I'm sort of a bit more on the fence now, just because it's going to take so long. When we look at the data from Davos, in terms of how long is it going to take to have gender parity anywhere in the world of work. The previous report said it's going to take 170 years. They've just done an update that now says it's going to take 217 years. So that's quite a while, actually, to wait. So I'm wondering what else we can do to kind of move the agenda forward. I do think it's important, though, to use the data to set some targets, to say, well, what are our strategic priorities around candidate attraction and those sorts of things. In terms of attraction, I'm a believer in science. I'm not a believer in political correctness, but what the science tells us is when you're using your things like, images in your job adverts and things like that, if you have a whole bunch of, images, and you've got basically a whole bunch of white men, that definitely has an impact in terms of who applies for roles and who doesn't apply for roles. So it is important that you make sure that you're very aware of the language that you use in candidate attraction material and also the images that you use. That stuff actually does work in terms of whether people perceive themselves to fit into your organisation. In terms of shortlisting, most of us these days will be using things like resumes or CVs. In an ideal world, I would advocate using an application form, because when you've got a CV, it's very difficult to do blind decision making. It's very difficult to take information off. So what we know from behavioural science is if you take somebody's name off an application form, you don't have that name, so you can't fall into affinity bias. If you have other information like somebody's postcode, what university somebody went to, hobbies and interests and stuff like that, that information starts to infect our decision making. It's really difficult just to strip that off on that one piece of paper. If we have an application form, all of that front end stuff can go on a front sheet. That can be stripped off and go into a HR system. And then the hiring manager gets a separate information that says, these are our competencies and these are the answers from the candidate that we're looking for. It's much more sophisticated. And it definitely shows to have a fundamental impact actually in terms of shortlisting, although I do recognise that it's slightly more administrative in terms of organisational thinking. Interviews, we know that the interview process, often things like, organisational fit comes in. So really what we're saying is to what extent is the candidate like us? So we're looking for things like cultural fit. Actually, in many ways, cultural fit is quite useful actually. There's lots of research that talks about when we have people who are similar, in many ways that falls into group cohesion, and cohesion is really useful in terms of high-performing teams, organisational decision-making can be quicker and stuff like that. So it's a fine balance between cohesion, which we want, and conformity, which we don't want actually. So that's something for you to think about. I would definitely advocate using group interview processes and also follow a preset script of questions. If you use a group interview process and use a preset set of questions, again, affinity bias may creep in, but it's much more likely to be mitigated through that process itself. And then the final thing in terms of the debriefing, as you're going through the interview process, make sure you score candidates, and you can score them whatever system you want. It can be a 1 to 3 scoring metrics, it can be a 1 to 5 scoring metrics, but if you aggregate the score, and then you compare candidates based on an aggregated score system, you are much more likely to appoint the person that has higher skills and higher attributes, and you are far less likely to appoint people based on things like affinity. That's really cool actually, because the research from Harvard and other places saying that an aggregated scoring system is super efficient actually in terms of trying to promote diversity in terms of our workforce. So do go for that. The other thing that I would say is try and build in some kind of devil's advocate into the process. Keep it simple. For me, that would simply mean have somebody on the interview panel that thinks different from you. Somebody that's there and their job is to say, when you're having conversations, to say, actually, Dan, I think you're falling into, affinity bias, because how you're describing this candidate and how you're talking about this candidate, you've really got no evidence for what you're saying. So have somebody in your organisation it's got to be somebody who's got a fair amount of authority and power and responsibility. Otherwise, you can just kind of brush that voice aside. But a devil's advocate, with all that system stuff actually, has shown to have quite a useful effect as well. So this stuff's quite cool actually, and the reason that this stuff's quite cool is because it's based on science which says when you implement some of these things, from using systems like Textio to the aggregate scoring system, without question you are likely to change who goes through your system. So you are much more likely to increase diversity through your recruitment process. That's all great and that's all fine, but as we said earlier, there is an issue about once we get people in, we then start to say, right, you're in, but now you need to conform to organisational norms. So we end up with that kind of high diversity, low inclusion thing. So that's all the stuff about diversity in terms of recruitment. Once we get people in, there's some really interesting stuff coming out in terms of what we can do. My basic thing is, as I said to you earlier, is human beings are wonderful. We are beyond the realms of possibility in terms of what science knows, but we can't be trusted in terms of making sensible and fair decisions, actually. So rely less on your own instincts and rely more on checklists. Things that you can do, there's obviously lots of debates now around not just diversity in organisations, but diversity at the executive and senior level. When we go into organisations, one of the first things that we ask for when we're doing audits is we say, can I have a look at your pipeline data? And one of the things which is interesting for me is that the pipeline generally looks like people that are already at the top. So the question is, why is that? And we actually know why it is. We know that unconscious bias impacts in a number of key areas. One is work allocation, one is feedback, and one is informal support and mentoring. So things that you can do to try and mitigate bias within the pipeline is make sure if you're allocating stretching projects, be really mindful of how you basically dish out work and who gets it. Visibility is important. I'm a great fan actually of this notion of what's called amplification. Amplification was developed in the White House under Barack Obama. It's pretty cool. It was the usual thing where you'd have a team meeting, a female would make a suggestion, not really picked up, and a guy would say it and he'd be like, hey, that's amazing. So the women were like, right, we've had enough of this. So what they started to do on an informal level is if somebody made a suggestion, assuming it was a good one, another female colleague would pick up on that and go, hey Jane, that was great, you know, let's kind of like take it offline after the meeting. And then after the meeting, they would start circulating emails to really amplify the voice of the person who made the suggestion. So it's really about giving voice, visibility and credibility to people who are different. Barack Obama got wind actually of what they were doing and actually liked it, and he essentially formalized the process. So you can develop the principle of amplification in your own organizations. It doesn't only apply to gender, you can apply it to any diversity strand, but it's just about giving voice to people who are different. And you can apply that in lots of ways. You know, even if you have, you know, maybe a presentation to do to an internal stakeholder or an external stakeholder, really think critically about who gets to do that presentation, you know, who gets the visibility and the rest of it. Even very simple things, what we call micro behaviours, you know, who gets to chair the meetings and all of that sort of stuff. Sponsorship, many of you will be doing things like mentoring programs and sponsorship programs. Some data from the Centre for Talent and Innovation based in New York says that as a comparative, sponsorship is much more effective in terms of talent retention and talent progression in our organisations. Mentoring is definitely effective, so I wouldn't advocate not using mentoring actually, but I think that sponsorship is showing to have a greater impact in terms of those things like retention. Also question, we get calls all the time, so I spend my life basically doing stuff like this. So all over the world we're travelling and we're asked to speak at conference panels and stuff like that. We send a message back actually, so if we're asked to speak on a conference panel, we do ask who's on the panel. I have a personal principle, it's not very big, it's something that is important for me though. And one of the things that I say to the organiser is who's on the panel. And if the panel is a whole bunch of white men, I always say thanks but no thanks. And I think it's about role modelling what you believe in. And I think that's important as well. So in your own organisations, when you're doing events, when you're doing panels, be very mindful of who's on there. That stuff is not about political correctness. That stuff is saying is, when I go into organisations and I look up and I look at the pipeline and I look at executives, what I basically see is a whole bunch of people that look like me. So if I worked for those organisations, what it would say at the psychological level is, Dan, if you work hard, you can definitely make it here. Just look at the top. And there's a whole bunch of other people that look at conference panels and look at panels that you do internally, and they don't represent who you are. And that starts to have quite an interesting psychological impact. So make sure we have diversity on things like conference panels, you know, when we're doing client teams, when we're doing speaking events and all of that sort of thing, because it does have an impact in terms of not just who people are, but what people think they can be in your own organisational context. And then sort of moving towards wrapping up, what I'd say is where we use things like Textio in terms of looking at our job descriptions and person specifications, the same principles apply in terms of leadership assessment criteria. So in leadership assessment criteria, there are words, phrases. You know, if you think about a phrase like, you know, gravitas or presence. Well, what does gravitas mean? And an interesting question is, well, how could you measure it? So how can you measure whether somebody has presence or whether somebody has gravitas? In a way, it feels quite instinctual. So you might say, well, I actually know that person A has it, but I can't measure it. But that becomes slightly problematic. So it's really important that we have criteria in our leadership development assessment that is measurable, actually. And if it's measurable, we can apply evidence to it. And again, that would make the process fairer. And then finally, to just use some neutral observers. So when you're doing things like, leadership development, it's the same principle of having a devil's advocate in the recruitment process. If you have neutral observers and their role is to challenge, support, etc., we know again that system is fair.